off by asking a few questions of my own, and then we were going to turn it over very quickly to all of you who probably have your own questions for Chuck. And then there will be a meet and greet afterwards, is my understanding. So hopefully, as you all know, Fight Club 2, the graphic novel, hits shelves tomorrow. You yourself are a character in Fight Club 2. What was behind that decision?
You know, the more things you have to cut to in something like a graphic novel, the easier it's going to be, because you know, really you have a page turn reveal every 2 pages. You've got to have a setup and a payoff. And I didn't realize this until I was committed to doing it. It was going to be the most intense plotting I had ever managed. So every 2 pages, you've got to have a really good setup and then a really good payoff as they turn that page. Because the theory is that people scan both pages, and the only way you can surprise them is that moment when they turn the page and they see the first thing in the top left-hand corner. That's the payoff. So you've got to have a great setup, great payoff. So the more things you have to cut to, you know, intercutting with the past, or intercutting with the future, or intercutting with dream sequences, fantasies, or intercutting to other characters in parallel plot lines, or intercutting to a meta plot line like yourself, the better off you're going to be. Because every 2 pages, you're going to have to cut to something significantly different to really keep that plot alive and really exploit that page turn reveal. And on another level, I was fascinated by a book that came out a couple years ago called The Program Era by Mark McGurl. And it's kind of an analysis of creative writing programs and what they've become in the United States. And one of the critical theories that's thrown out is that a lot of products of creating creative writing MFA programs tend to use their workshops to people their breakthrough novels. They say, for example, that Ken Kesey, when he was writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that he populated the mental hospital with parallel characters to the writers in his Stegner workshop down in Stanford. And so all of his peers who were in the program find themselves as these different damaged. And that when Toni Morrison wrote Beloved, she was also in a similar, I think she might have been in Iowa, and that she populated her plantation with the writers in her workshop. So if she liked you, she made you a sympathetic character in Beloved, and if she hated you, then you were Simon Legree. And so in a way, I wanted to seize that idea of writers using their workshops, their peer review sessions, as fodder for their fiction. And I wanted to do it in a very literal way, in a way that was more confrontive. So I made my characters, on the meta level, the workshop that I meet with, but I only use the public figures. I used Chelsea Kane, who's a best-selling thriller writer, and I used Monica Drake, who's a fantastic, lesser-known writer, whose big book is Clown Girl. I used Lydia Yuknevich, who was a bestseller last year with Small Backs of Children, and I used Susie Vitello, and I used Diana Jordan, who's a on-screen television journalist, because I didn't want to make the other people in workshop into public figures. I didn't want to submit them to that level of, you know, loss of privacy. So, in a way, with a meta-narrative, I needed something to cut to in addition to all the other things to cut to. And I wanted to kind of make fun of that paradigm of writers using their workshops to populate their fictional world.
So in your books, you tend to challenge readers, challenge their assumptions, their squeamishness. Do you pick storylines that challenge your own ideas as well?
I don't really pick, yeah, I do. It used to be among my peers when I was in my 20s, really the only rite of adult passage we had was to all pile into a caravan of cars and drive to Seattle, because Seattle had an IKEA. And we would all come away with these little bric-a-brac IKEA things that we could afford. But better than that, we came away with a big fat IKEA catalog, which was like a blueprint of how to be an adult. That this is what you needed to put your shit together, and this is how your life would look. And it was just such a primer for this is adulthood, because we didn't have any other primer. We didn't have any other blueprint. We had IKEA. And one day I'm sitting at my desk at Freightliner, and I'm looking at the IKEA catalog thinking, okay, what sofa will go with what chair? Because I don't want to be like everybody else. I want my IKEA stuff to be kind of special. And I thought, this is so fucking pathetic. That I am sitting here looking at this blueprint of what adulthood would be, because it's all I have. And I started to make fun of myself at that point by writing it into the story. And so whenever I recognize a fallacy in my own life, I try to write a short story about it. I've got a coloring book coming out in October, and friends of mine who see themselves as really progressive and liberal, one day their 9-year-old daughter Sophie came home from school. She had a pamphlet. It had a big rainbow, and it had Stegosaurus on it, and it had all these animals and all these multicultural children on it, and it said, "Come join us." And it was a local fundamentalist church. And suddenly Tammy and Matthew were just freaked out that their kid so badly wanted to go to a church. So we were talking, we decided that her first church experience should be so scarring that if a cute boy ever came up to her in junior high school and said, you know, "Kumbaya," she'd say. So we started planning, trying to locate those kind of strychnine drinking, snake handling churches, because that's what Sophie was going to have as her introduction. So she would never ever want to go to church again. And it became a story that went into the coloring book. But it is my way of processing not just my own experience, but the experience of my peers as these things go wrong. And that didn't fit your question, did it?
It was pretty close. So do you want to go back to it?
Please.
Okay.
Me too.
Yeah. It was, do you choose storylines that challenge your own assumptions and squeamishness and putting the meat box? I think you've addressed the meat IKEA box stuff.
Right, the IKEA thing, and then from there I was just gone. No, please.
Oh, no, that was the question again.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. What do you think of the fiction landscape these days?
Thank you. I've fed her that question. It goes back to the Mark McGurl book, because in the program Era, he makes a very convincing case that MFA programs had to standardize fiction in order to be able to teach fiction, and more importantly, in order to be able to grade fiction. So they had to create these 3 very rigid types of fiction against which literary fiction could always be graded. So they came up organically with high techno-modernism, which would be David Foster Wallace or Gaddis or Thomas Pynchon. Any kind of fiction that's really aware of itself in the postmodern world and kind of plays with that. And the other one was high cultural pluralism, which is any fictional narrative that's not straight and white. It's Sandra Cisneros, It is Joy Luck Club. It is, oh, help me out here. It is Swimming Pool Library. It is, to some extent, Mysteries of Pittsburgh. It is all of these not straight, not white cultural novels. Junot Diaz. And then the third category was, for those of you who are straight and white, dirty realism. Kmart realism, they call it. And Kmart realism is typified by Raymond Carver and Joyce Carol Oates, Dennis Johnson. Writers who write as heterosexual white characters whose greatest concern is money. That they haven't succeeded to becoming officially white because they're poor. So it's an aspiring to be white form of literature, Kmart realism. So if you are Catherine Dunn, God bless her, and you wrote Geek Love, you don't fall inside that pyramid. You're going to get an F because you're not one of those three things. And David Foster Wallace wrote a fantastic essay about it where he said, you know, you've got to have that pyramid because if you try to teach people how to reinvent fiction with every writer, you're going to be an alcoholic really soon. It's best to have a standardized thing and teach the standardized thing so you can do your own writing on the side and you're not constantly burning out teaching other people how to be original and creative. So that's kind of what the fictional landscape has fallen to in literary fiction. I really have to agree with him. And then when someone comes into the picture like Kurt Vonnegut, they don't know where to put him. He doesn't fall within that. So he falls inside of science fiction sometimes. And he just kind of, I think most of my books fall outside of the pyramid as well. And it's a tough place to be if you're not inside the pyramid because they don't know where to shelve you and they don't know how to market you. They can't say, this is the new Joy Luck Club. No.
Good answer. I'm assuming all of you have actually read more than one of Chuck's books, but for those who are not here, I'm guessing most people start with Fight Club, and then they will move on to Fight Club too. But what would you recommend that they read of yours afterwards?
Most of them actually start with Guts. Because they've got a friend who says, oh, you've got to read this story. And so it is that little, it's like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Yeah. You read it and you think, wow, I want every story to do that. But the one book that I kind of wish that they would move on to is Beautifully You. Because Beautifully You, for me, was a real breakthrough novel. It was attempting to write not just bad, but really bad erotica, and also to really just enjoy all the conventions of popular literary fiction. The white heroine who is, and this is such a great point, this is maybe the brightest thing Truman Capote ever said. He said, Americans don't like classic, natural, beautiful anything. Americans want somebody plain who has been groomed and stylized and tanned and aerobicized and primped until he or she can pass as beautiful. They want a victory over plainness. Because somebody who's born beautiful is not fair. That's not fair. They want to see somebody like Tori Spelling. Or Sex and the City. Sarah Jessica Parker. See, if you're thin, then you can pass as beautiful. They want to see a victory over Grace Kelly. They want, Grace Kelly was beautiful, but kind of in an unfair way. So many classic American novels. What is the first line of Gone with the Wind? Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful, but men seldom noticed that. I think that's the first line. But the point is, Americans want charm. They want something that transcends a pure classic beauty. And so in Beautiful You, the character is not short or tall or thin or fat. She's not this, she's not that. She's just that nebulous Scarlett O'Hara that everyone can project themselves into. And then she's got a culturally coded, not white best friend who's really sassy. And it's downhill from there. It is kind of every trope that you could cram into the devil. Originally the book was called Twilight of the Clan of the Cave Bear, Devil-Wearing Prada, Twilight, something. Because it included all those tropes from all those novels. And more importantly, it did something that my worst students, when I taught, always do, that always breaks my heart, is that they start with their most important story, the thing that happened to them that ruined them for the rest of their life. Their abuse incident, their attack, some horrible, horrible thing after which they were never the same, that they were forever damaged. And they start with that, and they start with a shortage of writing skills. So their execution of that most poignant thing ends up becoming comic. And it's heartbreaking to see them read it, and they're emotionally engaged in it. They don't realize how poorly they've executed it. And they don't realize that everyone listening to it kind of wants to laugh, just because they have done it such a disservice. They've so dishonored the experience by depicting it really, really poorly. And so the whole point of Beautiful You was to depict these over-the-top, upsetting, dramatic things, but to depict them with the most trite tropes and cliches and poor writing I could pull out of other books. And it was a blast to write. It was just such a joy to write. Anyway, so.
Do you think readers got that? Got what you were trying to do?
The writers I know who are readers got it instantly. They're like, wow, this is the blueprint for a bad novel. This is the gold standard of bad novels. But a lot of people, I think, will probably read it very literally and be very upset by it.
So now everybody here is clued in, though, about how to read it. All right, I'm going to open the floor up to questions. So please go to the microphones if you have questions, and then I'll call out the number. All right, number 3.
Okay, I wrote it down so I don't fumble. Hi, I'm Tori. So your readers have come to expect, outside the norm subjects from you and challenging probably things that we all think about but would never say out loud. Do you find the pressures of that writing? Do you write for your audience or do you write for yourself? And does that conflict ever hinder your process?
Yeah, there's an Andy Warhol quote, and I hate to use the word art, but he said art. Art is what you can get away with. And so I'm always thinking, what can I get away with? Someone was telling me this last weekend about going to a llama farm, and they tell you not to pet the llamas or hug them or to caress them too much because there's something called berserk llama syndrome. And the llama, especially the younger llamas, will imprint on you, and they'll start to think that humans are llamas, and there's been attempted llama rapes. Yeah. So instantly I'm thinking, okay, how can I get away with that?
I don't think I could have expected a a better answer than that. Thank you. Thank you.
So often, it's an idea that is really upsetting and dark and horrible. And those are the ideas that stay with you. And then you've got to process them by turning them into something else. I see writing and storytelling as a digestive process. That you've got to use the material or you will be used by the material. So as soon as someone tells me something horrible, I'm already trying to turn it into something palatable and marketable and use it so that so it doesn't dominate me.
My favorite novel of yours is Choke, so
Is
you
Choke?
see where you did that a lot more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, number 4, please.
So I noticed with a lot of your books, especially Diary, Guts is the prime example of this, a little bit as well in, the name of that book escapes me right now, Survivor. There are extended sequences of things that are very difficult to read and leave a very powerful imprint on the mind. And they always seem to exist in this almost Goldilocks zone of, I have to know more, but I can't bring myself to think about this for another second. When you're writing these powerful, graphic descriptions, segments of your book, how do you know when to stop? And how do you know when to keep going? Because there is a limit, I think, where if you could have kept writing a little bit more in Guts, people would have never read it or anything you wrote ever again. So yeah, what's your Goldilocks zone, and how do you go through that thought process when you're writing something like that?
Don't take this the wrong way, but have you ever had sex? There is something really... No. Rhetorical question. There's something really tantric about creating tension in a narrative and taking it and taking it and taking it and then cutting it. Because you will exhaust people emotionally and physiologically if you just take them to that place. You cannot get them there. You cannot get them there in a straight escalation. You have to take them to a place that's okay. A friend of mine, when he was 13 years old, he heard all about pegging. Pegging, I can't remember. Anyway, another friend of mine, he had a brother in the Marines who wrote home and said, and so you take them to this laughable thing, and then you cut the tension. And then you take them to a slightly more, and there on the x-ray was a bright white V of the wax. And then you cut the tension. Because there's a big, big digression between that cut, which goes into a big esoteric, the last wave of teen suicide was all about kids beating off while they hung themselves. And it's a big aside, it's kind of dark, but it's a big rest period. What got me into trouble, I used to call it pearl diving. And so you're starting that last roller coaster hill. And at this point, people are really trusting you. They're going to believe you're not going to hurt them anymore. Because you've made them laugh, and then made them laugh, and then cut it back, and now you're not going to make them laugh. And they don't know that. And it's just going to be a straight shot up to Helltown. So I kick at it. I kick at the rubbery skin and veins of it, and more of it seems to pull up out of the pool drain. It's maybe half as long as my leg now, but getting longer. And then you just let them have it. And you just hit, and you just hit, and you just hit. And every once in a while you cut the tension with, if I told you how it tasted, you would never ever eat calamari again. Or 1 minute you just get a kid getting off, and the next minute you'll never be a lawyer. You do these little callback humors so that you give them these little respites. I'm not going to play with your nipples for a moment. Okay, now I'm going to play with your nipples. You keep cutting the tension to keep them with you and to keep their trust. And then even at the very end, there's the big, big payoff. And then my sister, Mr. Peary. And everyone has this massive fallback to, my worst fear in the entire world is my teenage virgin sister thinking she's just getting fat and then giving birth to a two-headed retard baby.